Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to try without the mic, and we'll see if I can be heard. As Hanko was saying, I'm a UNHPIR, and I'm also a full-time working writer. My last book is this, Grover Cleveland's Rubber Jaw, which is a book of bizarre presidential trivia. And I refuse to talk about the JFK and the LBJ chapters in public, in mixed company, or in the media, because I discovered some horrible things about those guys. But the rest of the book is totally family friendly. Several semesters ago, I taught a course here called The New Gothic Horror of Stephen King. It was a very popular course, and it was basically a look at an overview throughout an entire semester of the work of Stephen King, his career, his life, his legacy, and the films. We read The Shining, we read short stories, we read a lot of his nonfiction stuff. The thing about Stephen King is that he is now finally being recognized as a more literary writer than many had initially perceived him to be. I was one of the first writers to talk about the literary merit of King's writing, and you know what book did it? The Shining. The Shining is an epic novel that I don't know a single writer who would not be proud to have written that book. King was not at his peak, but he was on fire during the era which fans and scholars refer to as King Classic, or Classic King with a K, Classic King. That was when he was starting out, and it began with Carrie, and then went through, you know, Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Stand, The Shining, The Dead Zone, Firestarter, Cujo, Pet Sematary, etc. That era was just, it still is a fan favorite. The thing about King is that beyond the popularity of his work, he has achieved the trinity of acceptance in American letters. And what does that mean? King is one of the few writers who has a popular appeal. Let's face it, hits the bestseller list with every book, okay? He has an academic appeal. He is studied in high school and college. The Shining is one of the most taught novels, okay? And in fact, what's interesting is that Dr. Anthony Magistrale at the University of Vermont, right after I read The Shining, and it was, believe it or not, my first King book. I had not known of him prior to The Shining. And of course, I went right back and immediately got everything from Carrie up, including short stories and so forth. But right after I did The Shining, and I said, why isn't this guy getting the recognition as a writer that this book warrants? And within months, Anthony Magistrale came out with a book of literary essays on The Shining, a book about the book. And that's usually not done. And there was like 20 or 30 academic essays that could fit in literary journals deconstructing The Shining, which I still consider, well, on my Essential Stephen King, where I rank, you see the brochure where I rank the top 100, at The Stand, The Shining. I consider The Shining his third greatest effort, his third greatest work. So I started with The Shining, and from that point on, I had been keeping up with him and reading everything that he wrote, everything that he published. And in 1989, I want to show it to you, excuse me, I wrote the complete Stephen King Encyclopedia, this thing. This took me 5 years to write. And the official title of the book is The Shape Under the Sheet, which is a term that King came up with in the introduction to Night Shift, in which he basically tells us, what does a horror writer do? Well, the horror writer takes you in a room and he shows you the shape under the sheet and he lets you touch it. And what is the shape under the sheet? Your own dead body. This was King's This was King's philosophy about the purpose of horror writers. So the publisher hired an artist to do some King illustrations, and this one is my favorite. This was done by Stephen Bissett, who created Swamp Thing. This was his artistic interpretation of the title of the book, The Shape Under the Sheet. Okay, and then there's signatures throughout this book and all kinds of pictures, and it's essentially an encyclopedic overview of King's work that right now is woefully out of date. It's complete through 4 past midnight, and that took 5 years. It's an 18,000 entry A to Z of the people, places, and things in King's world, King's universe. And if I do update it, I'd have to bring it current through today. And I just don't have the 5 years to put into one more book just to update that, unfortunately. I wish I did. Who is Stephen King? First of all, he's one of the world's most recognizable celebrities, okay? He was born in 1947 in Portland, Maine, the son of Ruth Pillsbury King and Donald Edwin King. But Donald Edwin King was born Donald Edwin Pollock, P-O-L-L-O-C-K. And we have just discovered that when he was 23, he changed his name from Pollock to King, and then married Ruth, Stephen's mother, and gave birth to Stephen, and they had an adopted son named David. And then when King was 3, Donald went out for a pack of cigarettes. Literally, he said to his wife, "I'm going out for a pack of cigarettes," never saw him again. He abandoned the family. New research, including research done by PBS, has shown that he ended up in the Pennsylvania area. Apparently, he has an entire family there. And there was never any real explanation as to why did he change his name. However, I am going to show you in a slideshow as we move through the talk. We found a picture of King. PBS found a picture of King, Donald King. And he's standing in front of a wall with height markings. And there's a number under his face. Now, I don't know. Maybe it's me, but is that a mug shot? You know. So we're thinking that perhaps there had been something in his past or something he did that required him to change his name. When his father died, I believe, on the death certificate, he put Pollock for his name. But he's known as Donald Edwin King, and that's the name that Stephen King was christened with. King has sold more than 400 million books. That's the latest estimate. I think it's a little low. I think there's actually more than that. He's in 100 languages or more. I think that's a little low at this point. He's married to Tabitha Spruce King. She's also a novelist. She has 8 books out, including 8 novels and 2 nonfiction books, 10 books out. He has a son, Joe Hill. His movie Horns just came out, starring Daniel Radcliffe. That's based on Joe Hill. He goes by Joe Hill rather than Joe King. And this movie is based on his novel Horns. And what's interesting about Joe is that his middle name is Hillstrom, Joseph Hillstrom King. But for many years, he submitted his work as Joe Hill because he didn't want to be known as Stephen King's son. He wanted his work to stand on its own, and he went through what all writers do: rejection, rejection, rejection. But he was happy about that. From interviews I've heard him say, it's because he knew that when he did sell something, it would be because of the merit of his work. And he has. Heart-Shaped Box was his first novel. 20th Century Ghosts was a collection of short stories that he did. And now he's become, interestingly, a King fan favorite. And just as a quick aside, I saw an interview with Stephen King where he was asked, you know, you write 2 novels a year, give or take. Each of them is, 350,000 words, whatever. And we know why. It's because he writes every day. He actually sits down, he writes for 4 to 5 hours a day, 365 days a year. Although there was a rumor that he took off Christmas, 4th of July, and his birthday. And he said that was just kind of like a little game he used to play with the media. But the point is, he writes every day, okay? And the journalist said, well, what'll happen if something's unfinished and something happens to you? You almost died in 1999 when you were hit by the van, right? He said, Joe can take over. And I'm reading that, and the interviewer said, really? He says, oh yeah, he's got the voice that meshes with mine perfectly. And he's right. He's right. So I have a little thing I'm going to do with you in a second, but just keep that in mind when I was talking about it. His younger son, Owen King, is also a novelist. And he has a book out called Double Feature, which is very good. He's a bit more literary, I guess you might say, although Double Feature is a thrilling read, maybe not as supernaturally focused as Joe Hill's stuff. I mean, actually, a heart-shaped box is about a guy who buys a ghost on eBay, and Horns is about a guy who grows satanic horns. So clearly, his focus is more along the lines of his father. The Kings also have a daughter named Naomi, and she is a practicing Unitarian minister. And she writes, but only sermons. And they're online, you can find them. Point is, she's a really good writer, really good writer. King is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most movie adaptations of all time. I think that's a little low. And he's also the highest earning adult fiction writer. Now people say, well, James Patterson and Kuntz and Grisham and Tom Clancy, they were all very high earning. Yeah, but King's stuff just is at the top of the pyramid in terms of earnings. So he's won that. King won a National Book Award for distinguished contribution to American letters. In 2003, I have a photo of him accepting the award. And he pioneered electronic publishing. Stephen King published The Plant, Riding the Bullet, Guns, all as e-only books. And Riding the Bullet was a novella, and you could only buy it online. I think it was $5 the day it was released, and it was supposed to be secure. But I understand that they broke the encryption within 8 hours, and suddenly it was everywhere. Speaking of that, by the way, King is the most pirated author in the world. You can find PDFs of all of his stuff online if you look hard enough. And what can you do? Point is, it's going to be done. The popularity that comes with the name Stephen King is going to result in this kind of piracy. But, there's not a lot he can really do about it. And not a lot any writer can do about it. If something's taken down, it's immediately put back up elsewhere. So he pioneered electronic publishing. Later, stuff appeared in print, Riding the Bullet and The Plant, etc. But initially, he was one of the first writers to say, nothing between covers for this. You want it, you got to download it. So with the trend in ebooks, he does everything now in all formats. And in terms of recent Stephen King news, Mr. Mercedes came out earlier this year. On November 14th, his latest novel, Revival, is coming out. This is the book that Stephen King himself has said, I don't want anything to do with it anymore in terms of rereading. It's so dark and so terrifying that writing it was enough. And I've only read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but the people who have read it say, if you liked The Shining, if you liked Misery, if you liked Pet Sematary, this is in that zone. So you may find this really appealing. It's a big book, another big doorstop, okay? And that's coming out on the 14th. So, okay, here's what I want to do now before I continue. I'm going to read a paragraph to you, just a paragraph, and then I'm going to ask you a question, Okay? And here's the paragraph. It was warm for October, so I went for a long ride to nowhere on my motorcycle, a 7-year-old Triumph Bonneville. I turned back for home when the sky was the color of marigolds, dead leaves whisking across the road in my wake. And in the peaceful light of dusk, I had a perfectly natural thought. What if a bat hit me in the face right now? What if my visor dropped, trapping it inside my helmet, shrilling and biting? What if I went off the road and snapped my back and was left paralyzed, out of sight down the embankment with a dying bat in my helmet, its wings shattered, its claws scrabbling, the little white staples of its teeth sinking into me? I wasn't kidding when I said this was a perfectly natural thought. It is, for me. How many think that's Stephen King? Nobody? Who do you think it is? It's Joe. That's Joe King. That reads like a Stephen King passage. That's what his father meant when he said Joe could pick up where I leave off. Because the writing, the voice, the style is exactly the same. So Joe King seems to be traveling in the footsteps of his father because his focus, his interests, and his writing style. King's writing is broken into 3 distinct groups. The classic King category that I previously mentioned, classic with a K, and that runs from Carrie, 74, through the dark half, 89 or so. Then there's the middle period King, okay? And that's Gerald's Game, 92 through Hearts in Atlantis or so, around 2000, around the year of the accident, okay? That's middle. And then there's the post-accident King. That's from On Writing and Dreamcatcher through Under the Dome, Full Dark, No Stars, Mr. Mercedes, Revival, etc. And the thing is, the Stephen King voice is identical for all 3, but the focus, style, and subject matter are different. And the line of demarcation is probably it. Okay, by the way, if you heard the joke where a guy's talking to his wife and says, "Oh, I hear Stephen King has a new novel out. It's called It." And she says, "Oh, what am I supposed to do?" Say, "Honey, help, there's a pronoun in the basement." I know. And when we get to the stand, I have an Ebola joke, if you can believe it. I do. But after It came out, King said he decided to concentrate more on the monsters within than the monsters without. And the monsters without, zombies, mummies, Frankenstein, vampires, etc., it is like his master's thesis on any and all forms of monsters, since Pennywise could essentially become your worst fear. Then he went into the psychological horror, Misery, Dark Half. I mean, look at Dark Half. Dark Half, a writer is 2 people, or is he? In the Dark Half, it mimics his Bachman story. He used a pseudonym for 5 books, Richard Bachman. And then it was discovered, and so ultimately they had to say, yes, this is Stephen King, Richard Bachman. So he basically issued a statement that Richard Bachman died of cancer of the pseudonym. And Dark Half is about a writer who has decided to abandon his pseudonym. And in the book, there's a picture of the author on the cover of People magazine standing over a grave with a shovel, burying his pseudonym. Well, it turns out the pseudonym didn't want to go away. And suddenly he's being haunted by who? Is it just a manifestation of his psyche? Or has the pseudonym become real? Morphed into something real? So the point is, it's psychological horror. What he did was look at that inner workings, because he was writing as 2 people. And you know what's really interesting in terms of how he thinks? He does signings still, not a lot, but he does some of them. And when somebody shows up with a Richard Bachman book, he won't sign it. And they said, "Oh, Mr. King, why?" He says, "Because Bachman's dead." Well, can you sign Stephen King? I didn't write this book. Richard Bachman wrote this book, and Bachman is dead. And he won't sway from that. There are no books signed Richard Bachman because Bachman's dead. And King won't sign. And in fact, I heard a rumor that there may be a Bachman book out there that is signed by Stephen King. Those are probably worth your house in terms of value as a collectible. But he was very, very strict about maintaining that duality between Stephen King and Richard Bachman. And you know something? If you analyze the Bachman books and you look at The Long Walk and The Running Man and Road Work and Thinner and The Regulators, you will see a different voice. It's harder edged. It's a bit more brutal. Richard Bachman is not Stephen King. Even though, let's face it, Richard Bachman was. No, he really maintains that. But the point is of all that is that he's analyzing the psychology of writing constantly. And that whole period where he's done with Bachman and they reissued Thinner as a hardcover with a cardboard strip around it, Stephen King writing as Richard Bachman, because that book doesn't have Stephen King on it. Because somebody discovered his pseudonym just as that book was coming out in hardcover. So the publisher had to scramble because there's no way it would have sold Stephen King numbers, so they had to go back to press, they had to issue the cardboard thing, and it was essentially because somebody had realized that, and it was totally a publisher screw-up. Apparently they copyrighted all the Bachman books in the name of Stephen King. So a journalist went to the Library of Congress, looked up the Bachman books, and look at that, copyright Stephen King. And that was it. And they released it as a scoop, which it totally was. So, regarding King as a horror writer, he says there are 3 levels of fear that he tries to tap into when he's writing. Because the horror writer, the psychological thriller's purpose is to scare you. Let's face it. And the first, he wants to terrify you. Okay? He wants to terrify you to the point where sometimes you might have to close the book, okay? The Lincoln Tunnel scene in The Stand, those of you who have read it, that's terrifying, literally. It's almost unreadable. It's so frightening, okay? So he reaches that level of terrifying, okay? The second is to horrify. He wants to horrify the reader. He wants to put people in situations, have events occur that are horrifying. Little Gage Creed getting killed by the tractor trailer in Pet Sematary. That's horrifying. It's not terrifying, but it's horrifying. And notice the nuance between these verbs. You know, he can actually cite and write differently depending on his goal. Terrify, horrify. And the third, gross you out. And those are the 3 levels: terrify, horrify, gross out. Now, for instance, what would be an example of a gross out scene? Well, okay, creep show. They're creeping up on you. Anybody see it? Anybody know of it? This billionaire is found dead in a penthouse apartment, and it's spotless. Pure white, not a speck anywhere. And then, all right, this is gross, but we're talking about gross out, right? Thousands of cockroaches start spewing from his mouth. That's gross, okay? So anything that really taps into the visceral, my students, right? We studied visceral last week, the meaning of it. That's the meaning of it. When something is so disgusting that the response is visceral. Now, some King fans have said they actually sometimes will get nauseated. And maybe they're acting out a little bit, but I can't see that. I love King. I can read him without hesitation. But there are, if you read carefully, if you do a close read of his stuff, you will see the differences. Terror, horror, gross out. And every one of his works can be quantified and qualified by those. So many academics, literary critics, fans have described King as the Dickens Twain Poe of our time. And I happen to agree. I think that in 50 years, the best of King will continue to be read and continue to be taught. And speaking of Dickens, you're all familiar with The Green Mile, yes? That was originally published as 6 books. 6 thin books, once a month, for 6 months, totaling a novel. Because that's how Dickens used to send material here. People would wait on the docks for the next chapter of A Tale of Two Cities or Great Expectations, because Dickens was writing them serially. And King, actually one of his agents or one of his editors said, you know, you ought to try a serial novel. He's used to writing shorter works. He writes short stories and novellas all the time, nonfiction essays all the time. So he said, you know, that's a good idea. And he had the idea for The Green Mile about this huge guy accused of killing these twins. And he didn't, spoiler. And the reality was he could also heal. And King had the story not completely plotted out, but apparently he had enough of it where he could start it. And he had to turn in X amount of tens of thousands of words every month in order to meet the publishing schedule. And I read an interview with him where he talked about what a commitment it was, because when a publisher agrees to do a book, there's a lot that falls in line. I mean, they have to reserve time at the printer. They have to reserve X amount of paper. They have to reserve editorial time. They have to reserve design time. They have to add it to the catalog. They have to know the page count to determine the price. And if a writer screws up and doesn't meet a deadline, a lot of problems come about. So he had to commit to turning in 6 manuscripts in a row in order to get the book out on time. And he did it. Now, people don't wait on the docks for chapters of a British novelist's new book. But you know what the parallel is today? People waiting in line outside Barnes & Noble for the next Harry Potter book. We've seen it. It's been on the news. People do it. That's similar to what King did with The Green Mile. And then ultimately it came out both as the Tom Hanks movie and as a book, a single volume edition. And actually, it made my top 10. In the Essential Stephen King, I believe Green Mile is in one of his 10 greatest works. Now, moving on to Salem's Lot, King's 1975 novel Salem's Lot, it essentially invented the modern Gothic novel. And his childhood friend, Chris Chesley, who I interviewed for the Encyclopedia, he was telling me that they were sitting around a table in King's double-wide trailer in Maine when he was still living poorly in Bangor because he hadn't really made a fortune with Carrie. And they were talking about horror and Bram Stoker, Dracula. And the conversation turned to the question, imagine Dracula in the frozen food section of the grocery store. And it clicked. It clicked. He said that gave him the idea for a modern vampire. It's inspired by Dracula, of course, but the point is that he said, let's bring the vampire, the ancient, iconic, archetypal monster, blood-drinking monster, into modern times. How would he live? How would he function? Would people know? Would people be afraid? What would happen? And Salem's Lot came from that, which is considered one of his best works and one of his most frightening works. In fact, he tells a story about when he was writing it. He had a little shack or a little small building where he was writing, and he was writing at night. And he was typing, and he was typing, and he was typing, and it was dark, and it was quiet, and he was working, and all of a sudden he looks at the window, and there's a white-faced ghoul in the window. It was his wife playing a trick. He said he almost hit the ceiling because he screamed. And a funny story, but that was true, because when he was into it, he was living in Jerusalem's Lot up here when he was writing that book. So I want to talk very, very briefly, and I swear I'll keep this short. I'll keep this for the E110 classes. Literary theory, okay? I promise it'll be short. But bottom line is that there's a recurrent theme and motif in King's fiction, which is the night journey. And the night journey appears in a great many novels, not just horror novels, and it's basically a character enters a realm of darkness. Now, it could be empirical darkness, could be metaphorical darkness, could be both. And the travel through it, the character either triumphs or is vanquished. He either comes out into the light, metaphorically, or he is consumed, destroyed, killed, surrenders, whatever. Going back, the Lincoln Tunnel scene in The Stand is a classic example of King's use of the night journey. Walking through the Lincoln Tunnel that's filled with cars filled with dead people and no lights. And he hears a door open. There you go, and we're off and running, okay? That's an example of the night journey. So the character can either be killed, lose something, die, whatever. He has focused on this in a majority of his work, including short stories. And it's become a recognizable trope in his work. And that's just classic fiction, where a character has to travel through something. Because the whole point of plot is change. Characters change in fiction. And King uses influences that include monsters and the supernatural and the devil and whatever, killers and so forth, to accompany these people during their journey, okay? In The Stand, trip to Vegas, the trip to Boulder, sorry. So it's an interesting motif that King has repeatedly returned to. I understand Revival touches on many of the themes and elements that King has worked with in the past. So we're all looking forward to that. Another book I want to mention briefly is On Writing. 2000, King came out with a book called On Writing, and it's a combination of autobiographical memoir and writing tutorial. Now, in 1999, June 19th, King was hit by a van. And I'm going to talk about the accident in a second, but On Writing was half finished. Just the writing part. Just the writing instructional part. And then he was sidelined for quite a while because of the injuries he sustained in the accident. And when he went back to the book, he decided it needed to be more. And so he added another half, which was autobiography. And in it, he talked about his addictions, his alcoholism, the interventions from his family, and the accident and his recovery. He said that Misery is a cocaine book, in that Annie Wilkes is essentially cocaine. Figure that out metaphorically, and it makes all kinds of sense. Dreamcatcher, the novel he wrote while finishing On Writing, which was exactly after the accident, that's his OxyContin book. Because one of the negatives about almost dying from this accident is that it resurrected his addictions. When you're that injured, even if you are an addict, you need painkillers. You'll die from the pain if you don't. So he said that Dreamcatcher was written with OxyContin in his bloodstream constantly. Interestingly, it's his least favorite of his books. And the other one is Tommyknockers. Tommyknockers was also written during a period of addiction. And you know, I read that book when it came out, and I said, this book is 350 pages too long. And he just said in Rolling Stone this week, you know, that book is 350 pages too long. It is. It's 700 pages, and it needed an editor. But there was a period where King was, at the time, just basically writing and turning stuff in. And now his editor is brilliant. He loves him, and he works with him on all his books. And I think that, that was a major shift, because it's no good for a writer to have a blanket acceptance of everything he or she does. I used to play piano in bars, and I was in bands when I was young, and I always said to myself, I've never not learned something from watching another piano player. Even I was decent. I wasn't great. But even a poorer player than me, if I watched him or her, I always learned something. So reviewing one's work is a huge part of the publishing paradigm, of the publishing process. And King's work was not being reviewed for a while by editors. He was just fulfilling contracts. And so Tommyknockers and Dreamcatchers are his least favorite book. What do you think, those of you who are knowledgeable about King, what do you think King says is his favorite of his novels, of his works? Those of you who read Rolling Stone, don't chime in, because he says it in that. What do you think King picks as his favorite of his books? You read Rolling Stone. Lisey's Story. She's right. She's absolutely right. That's his favorite of his books. What about The Stand? That's a fan favorite. No. What about It? That's fan favorite. Nope. Lisey's Story is his favorite of his books, which says a lot. It says a lot about his focus, his intent, the writing. So on writing was his way of getting on paper everything that happened to him from the accident. I want to read another paragraph to you. And this speaks once again to the thesis that King's writing is particularly literary, better than a lot of his naysayers have said. Although, as I said, things are coming around now, and he's being recognized as a much better writer than... You know what it was in the early years? It was the media's perception that nobody this popular can be good. They said that about the Beatles. Nobody could sell out stadiums and sell records like them and be good, because America likes schlock. And that's what's gonna sell. Totally untrue. And now with King, it's the same thing. Plus, this also indicates and illustrates that there is a huge amount, a huge body of King work that most average King fans have no knowledge of. What I'm going to read you, it's a paragraph from an essay, a nonfiction essay called Leaf Peepers. And it was in the New Yorker in 1998, the New Yorker, right? And it's about that ritual of people visiting Maine in the fall to see the foliage. And the Maine people, any of you Maine residents know, they're called, all the leaf peepers are here. And King, he knew that. And so he wrote this essay talking about these visitors, which became a contemplation and a meditation on not only the change of seasons, but the change of life and how life works in essentially seasons, okay? So it's only one paragraph, but it's one of his more lyrical passages, and it's very beautiful. Romantics compare the cycle of the seasons to the cycle of human life, a comparison I never really trusted. And yet now, at the age of 51, I find something in it, after all. Sooner or later, life takes in its breath, pauses, and then tilts toward winter. I sense that tilt approaching. When the idea threatens to become oppressive, I think of the woods in New England tilting into winter, how you can see the whole expanse of the lake, not just the occasional wink through the trees, and hear every movement on the land that slopes down to the water. You can hear every living thing, no matter how cunning, before snow comes to muffle the world. The entire essay is like that. And again, it focuses on not just the leaf peepers, which could have been a fun, trite, unimportant piece. Oh, the tourists are here. But instead, he looks at it, and notice he was only 51 in that, only 51. Well, I guess to you guys, that 51 is old. To us, people like me, 51 is young. You know, we wish we were that age again. So there's leaf peepers, And then one more paragraph, and then I'm done with the reading, and then we'll do the slideshow. And if we have time, then we'll talk about the top 10 in my Essential King. This is the opening paragraph from Bachman, a Bachman book called The Regulators. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's one of his lesser-known novels, okay? Now, this is a long, after the first two words of the paragraph are "summer's here," but then he has a sentence. I don't know an English teacher who would say run-on sentence, because when they're done right, and there are a lot of writers who did, Dickens could do them, page-long sentences, but they worked with the proper punctuation, the proper parsing, the proper phrasing. This is one of those paragraphs that is long, but is not run on, because he captures a moment beautifully and lyrically in a way that serves the function of the paragraph, so to speak, okay? So here it is, and it's not that long, it's just one paragraph, but, and I don't just take a breath and go. I have to stop in the middle and breathe because it's a little long. Summer's here. Not just summer either, not this year, but the apotheosis of summer, the avatar of summer, high green, perfect central Ohio summer, dead smash in the middle of July, a white sun glaring out of that fabled Levi sky, the sound of kids hollering back and forth through the Bear Street woods at the top of the hill, the tink of Little League bats from the ball field on the other side of the woods, the sound of power mowers, the sound of muscle cars out on Highway 19, the sound of rollerblades on the cement sidewalks and smooth macadam of Poplar Street, the sound of radios, Cleveland Indians baseball, the rare day game, competing with Tina Turner, belting out Nutbush City Limits, the one that goes 25 is the speed limit, motorcycles not allowed in it, and surrounding everything like an auditory edging of lace, the soothing, silky hiss of lawn sprinklers. As surrounding everything like an auditory edging of lace, the soothing, silky hiss of lawn sprinklers. It's just beautiful. The imagery, the poetry, the internal rhymes, middle of July, fabled Levi's sky. But this is prose, it's not poetry. And yet, the artistic components of the piece can be deconstructed literarily, and you can see the excellence, you could see the skeleton of the work, and realize that the quality of writing is self-evident, okay? So that's a little bit of an overview on King in terms of his writing and his career. And lastly, I'll tell you about the accident, and then we'll look at the slides. On June 19th, 1999. Now, those of you who are serious King fans may know the number 19 plays a huge role in his life and in his fiction. There are many, many, many works where 19 has a symbolic, suggestive meaning, particularly in the Dark Tower series, okay? But 19 was always a big number. And in fact, he introduces the new edition of The Gunslinger with an essay called On Becoming 19. And he talks about that year for him, as well as the deeper meaning of it. So June 19th, King is walking along a road in Bangor, reading. He's walking facing traffic, but he's reading a book on the side of the road, facing traffic. Brian Smith, a down-home Maine boy. In fact, King at one point said, I got hit by one of my own characters, because that's Brian Smith. You could find him in Cujo, or you could find him in any of the Maine-based stories. You could find a character like Brian Smith. So the way it worked is Brian is driving like a Volkswagen bus. Now in the back, behind him, is a cooler with hamburger meat in it. Also in the back is his dog, Bullet. Bullet, we'll get to that. Bullet starts nudging the cover off the cooler. So this is exact. Brian Smith goes like this with the steering wheel. And here's King. Boom. At 40 miles an hour. Sent him 25 feet into the air. Collapsed lung, head injury. Biggest problem was his pelvis was sideways. A chopper came to bring him to Maine Trauma Center. And the helicopter operator, apparently they're trained for this, the EMTs, don't worry, Mr. King, you're going to be fine, because you never say anything negative to a patient. It's always encouragement. You're going to be fine. Everything's going to work out. Later on, the pilot visited King and told him, I didn't think you'd make it to the hospital. That's how severe his injuries were. So long story short, he had 5 surgeries in 5 days. He described his leg as a sock full of marbles. Even in his pain, he's coming up with artistic images to describe the wreck that he was. His wife rented an apartment or a condo across the street from the hospital to stay by his side. He's in the hospital for weeks, multiple surgeries, terrible pain, addiction again. And that was when he wrote Dreamcatcher. And it's a vulgar, visceral, gross book. Okay? It is. It totally is. But, you know, like many, not me, I mean, you know, many other readers and critics have said, you know, it was him spewing figuratively the pain, the anger, the dismay at what happened to him onto paper. He can do that. If he's emotionally distraught, he can create characters and scenarios that speak to that state of mind. Okay? So, he wrote Dreamcatcher in longhand. Tabitha went out and got him, you must have seen them, these big, tall, leather-bound accounting ledgers, and columns, right? And he wrote with a fountain pen in filling 2 of them with the novel Dreamcatcher. And just to indicate just who he is and what he means to popular culture and literature, he's in agony, and they sold the film rights to Dreamcatcher before he finished it. I said, my God, you know, he could, there's an old joke from his early career that when he was publishing so much, people used to say, Stephen King could publish his laundry list and people would buy it. But, you know, it's kind of demeaning, but I get it. I understand what he's saying, what that joke means, which is, you know, King is incredibly popular, and anything he writes, including his nonfiction, his poetry, his book reviews, his short stories, novellas, are incredibly popular and sought after. Now, here's the weird Stephen King part of his accident. Brian Smith's middle name was Edwin. Stephen King's middle name is Edwin. Stephen King's father's middle name is Edwin. Stephen King had published Riding the Bullet, and the dog's name was Bullet. And here's the one that most people just flip out about. On September 21st, 2000, Stephen King's 53rd birthday, Brian Smith was found dead in his trailer of an overdose of fentanyl painkiller patches on King's birthday. He was asked, if you can imagine, you know, was he cursed? Was there a curse on? But the point is, all of these weird, the 19th, Bullet, the guy dying on King's birthday, the middle name. I mean, how weird is that? You know, and truth is stranger than fiction, though, isn't it? Now, regarding the van, King bought it. Why? Because he didn't want to see parts of it on eBay. And that would have happened. People would have found ways to get the mirror, the seat of the van that almost killed Stephen King on eBay, $20,000 opening bid. People would have, so he bought it. He says he wished he had had the chance to go at it with a sledgehammer, but he didn't, and it ended up going into a car crusher and being complete. Any of you familiar with Breaking Bad? The way they got rid of the trailer? That's what they did with the van. And then it went, nobody knows where it went. It was completely disposed of. Because, believe it or not, people would have sold off parts of that van if they could get their hands on it. So he ended up buying it himself and didn't get the visceral joy of trying to destroy it. Okay? So let's see. Well, how much time do we have? Well, not too much. All right. Let's do the slideshow. I'm going to show you these slides one by one and just tell you a little bit about it. And then if we have a chance, we have to do the raffle, and then I'll take some questions. We probably won't get to discussing the top 10, but I can tell you this. My number one book in the Essential Stephen King is It. I think It is the greatest thing King has ever written. If I update the book, there will be things I'll have to add, like 11/22/63, the book in which the guy goes back in time and stops the Kennedy assassination. Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, but I can get away with that because I can keep that where The Shining is and just put like indented and say sequel. I won't have to give up a spot on the 100 for Dr. Sleep, etc. But I still think It, not having read Revival, okay, but I still think It is number one. And then The Stand. And here's the joke. Those of you who know what The Stand is about, 99.44% of the world's population is destroyed by a virus. Okay? And King took the number from Ivory Soap. Remember Ivory Soap used to advertise, we're 99.44% pure. Okay? So he said, well, my virus is going to wipe out 99.44% of the world's population, and what's left are going to be in good and evil camps. Good led by Mother Abigail, evil by Randall Flagg. Okay, fine. So here's the relevant joke. Have you heard the new Ebola joke? You won't get it. Huh? I know, I'm sorry. Okay, this is the Kings when the kids were young on Halloween. This is Uncle Stevie today. This is Stephen King as a little boy. Big smile, suspenders, okay? This is the family when they were young. King is holding Owen. Tabitha is hugging Joe, and that's Naomi. This is a very rare picture of Stephen King with his mother that I got from his brother David. And the family hadn't even been aware of this, many in the family. I included it in my encyclopedia. And it's a few years before his mother died. King was bearded. He was college age at that point. There he is, Donald Edwin King. Looks like his son, doesn't he? Or I should say his son looks like him, doesn't he? So unless you know of ID pictures that are taken with height indicators on the wall behind them, I got to go with this possibly being a mugshot. I don't know. I heard from someone that he was in the Merchant Marines, Donald King, and that's how they took ID pictures. I have not been able to confirm that, but regardless, I don't think they would put a number under his head in the Merchant Marines. They might use his name, you know. But in any case, that is Donald Edwin King. That's Stephen King's father. There's Stephen King after selling his very first short story, The Glass Floor, which appeared in Startling Mysteries magazine. Still smoking, working at a typewriter. Just a look at some of his novel titles, novel covers. Many of you are familiar with a lot of these. There's King with Owen. That was on the picture. That's on the back of 4 Past Midnight. That's Owen King, the guy who just wrote double feature. Stephen King participating in the horror selfies thing that's going around online. Horror writers are taking selfies involving horror or something like that and sending them, and they're being posted on horrorselfies.com. A picture from today of me is going to be up there after we get through with everything and I get the pictures. I was asked to send one in. That's King. He did that. Read more scary books. There's King in front of his house. those bats and the spider web design were designed by the American architect I.M. Pei, P-E-I. He also designed the pool room of King's house, all the architecture. Today, King does not open the house to Halloween. He did when he was just starting out, and they would dress in costume and so forth. Today, a Bangor PD police car sits in front of the house because you're not going to believe this, it's true. People came with blowtorches to take the bats off the fence. He had to have those replaced many times because they would steal the bats. So that's done with. This is an aerial view of King's house with the pool room, and it's an incredible spread. This is King, Tabitha, and Owen for a C-SPAN seminar on writing, where they all talked about their books and gave writing tips. This is the King family today. There's Naomi. Stephen is standing. Owen and his wife Kelly Braffett, also a novelist. Tabitha at the end, and Joe Hill opposite Kelly, and that's Marlowe the dog down the bottom. That's King's Florida house. Again, a big spread. That's it from an aerial view. It looks like a subway car, but it's considered this incredible achievement in modern architecture, and they say the views are unimaginably beautiful from every window in the house. Okay, that's the original stand. That's the one where he decided to add back 400,000 words, because when the first one was published, he did not have the publishing clout so that anything he wrote could be published. Then, suddenly, all of these books started making him incredibly popular, so he said, you know, what I really wanted to do is reissue the stand the way I originally wrote it. So he came out with for the first time, complete and uncut edition. 400,000 words added back. My novel is 72,000 words by itself. What he cut was 400,000. This is the type of prolific output that this guy is capable of. It's unbelievable. That's the movie edition of The Green Mile. That's the complete book, where the whole book is in, the whole novel, all of the 6 segments are in one book. That's an issue of Midnight Graffiti magazine, which King published exclusive story in it called Rainy Season, and I wrote an article for this edition called The Uncollected Stephen King, in which I talked about lost stuff that King fans weren't aware of, rarities, things that were just out there but no fans were really aware of. And that's the book I'm auctioning off today. That's by me. That's my tie too, see? And this is my friend Sean right here. This is you, right? He was in a bookstore and he found this. It's the Portuguese edition of my book, which I did not know existed. I swear to God. They sell translated editions all the time. I have no idea if it's accurate because I can't read or write Portuguese. So I gotta hope that they translated it correctly, and that's the cover of it. This is a big interview with King by, how many have heard of Neil Gaiman? Gaiman interviewed King. So this was a really unique moment in terms of King history. That's the guy, he's a real estate agent, he's dead now. That's the guy whose picture was on the back of Thinner as Richard Bachman. He was a friend of King's agent, and this was the author photo because obviously King and Bachman are 2 different people. So this is the guy who posed for the author picture as Richard Bachman. That's me and Owen King. That's King's youngest son, also a writer. That's King on the cover of Parade with his I Love Books t-shirt. That's the plant. King wrote a chapter for 6 years in a row of a novel called The Plant, self-published it through his own publishing company, and gave it out to friends and family as a Christmas card. He stopped after 6 Christmases, then took up writing it again, only online, and then stopped again and said, I'm done. I don't know where to go from here. So as you can imagine, this is a real weird anomaly in King's publishing history. It's the only thing he published and didn't finish. That was the Stephen King newsletter, which was in print for 5 years. Only King. It was a newspaper devoted to all things King. That was Stephen King's first published piece. It was a newsletter that he and his brother David did called Dave's Rag, and King published essays and short stories and poetry in it. And what's interesting is that I have some of the issues from Dave's Rag, and in one of them, he talks about this in his biography, the E of the typewriter died. So the entire newsletter has spaces for E filled in by hand by King and his brother in order to get the thing published. That's a collection of short stories that one copy exists. It's called People, Places, and Things, and it's a collection of short stories by Stephen King and his friend Chris Chesley that I mentioned. And they found it in a safe in King's office, buried under a stack of stuff. He was 47, 60, he was 13 when he and Chris wrote it. King has the only existing copy, but of course photocopies have been made of it over the years, and that's the front page of it. That black mark is a hole in the page that got, during the years it got ripped. Look, copyright 1960. That's the first short story King ever published. It was in a zine, a comics zine called In a Half World of Terror. Didn't get paid for it. Was still publishing as Steve King, as you can see on the byline. That's my significant other and King. She's on my website with hugging him, not me. That's her at the Bag of Bones book signing, wearing that white jacket. She had one made for King, and on the back of it is a 50,000 stitch illustration of the rock bottom remainders. They were very expensive, and she gave one to him, and she has one. That's his I Love Books shirt. This is a quick look at the Stephen King Facebook pages. This is Stephen King Lovers. Notice the members. 49,000, and that was like a month ago. So now it's near well over 50,000 members. This is the Stephen King Central King group. This is Stephen King Discussion Club. This is the Overlook, this is Schemers, which stands for Stephen King Emailers. It started as an email newsletter and now became a Facebook page. This is another Schemers group, Schemers on Facebook. This is All Things King, 3,600 members. And literally, these are all very active with people posting about King. Facebook has been unbelievably supportive of King. That's the cover of Twilight Zone magazine with King on the cover. The magazine doesn't exist anymore. That's when King made Time magazine's cover. And the novel, It. That was the novel that they wrote about. That's the hardcover dust jacket of King's first novel, Carrie, front and back. And that's a picture of David King just getting a haircut from his father. And that's Stephen King on the table after a bath. And while his father was still with the family. It was shortly after this that he abandoned them. And that's King's mother's yearbook page. Apparently she was noted for drama activities and public speaking. And again, this goes back to the Joe Hill thing. Is writing talent environmental or genetic or both? I mean, is it coincidence that King's mother was a public speaker, that King writes, that his children write, and that he found a box of paperbacks that belonged to his father after his father left, consisting of sci-fi and horror paperbacks, and his mother told him that his father had tried writing stories when he was younger. Is this coincidence, or is artistic ability passed down genetically? I think it's probably more genetic than environmental. You know, as I always talk about in class, writing as a craft can be taught. You can't teach imagination and creativity and inspiration. You can't teach imagination. If someone has the gene that makes them imaginative and creative, that's just going to be there. Of course, they then need to learn the craft of writing. But the point is, I think it comes down through the blood. I can't imagine how it doesn't. That is the cover of the New York Times Magazine with the King family. That's Tabitha on a giant tricycle. It is. And that's the kids. And that's King's farewell to all of you today. in tribute to Halloween, and that's him at the National Book Awards receiving his award for distinguished contribution to American letters. He had double pneumonia when he gave this speech, and his doctor said, don't go. He said, I have to go. And guess what his speech was about? About writing, no, it was a total tribute to his wife. He said, I have to go, I have to give this speech. And all he talked about was Tabitha and how he wouldn't be who he is without her. It was beautiful. And there we go. There's Pennywise, dancing clown. So that's it. I'm done. 2:10. It's 3:10, so we've got a little over an hour. Thank you. Now, thank you. Namaste.